I will not stand for this." The words were sharp, slicing through the air like a knife. The cry of the baby in the row ahead grew louder, more frantic, each shrill note piercing the calm of the first-class cabin. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO sitting in his perfectly tailored suit, tightened his grip on the armrests, his jaw clenching. He shot a frustrated glance at the flight attendant, Naomi, who was standing just a few feet away, her uniform neat, but her presence barely noticeable to the passengers who rarely looked up from their phones or luxury magazines. $50,000 to silence my baby, he snapped, his voice thick with impatience and entitlement. Naomi stood still, her face calm, but inside, her heart began to race. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. The humiliation in Richard's voice was clear. He saw himself as a man who could buy anything, even silence. The other passengers, a mix of executives and high-profile figures, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing around, but no one dared to speak up. Naomi was just the help, after all, the invisible woman who could be ordered around without a second thought. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, the sneers, the snide comments, but this was something else. A baby crying was an inconvenience, an embarrassment to a man like Richard, but to Naomi, it was just a child in need of comfort. She could almost hear his thoughts. Why hasn't she fixed this yet? Naomi took a deep breath, stepping forward slowly. The cabin fell silent as her heels clicked against the polished floor. The baby's cries were louder now, rising to a frantic crescendo. Richard's eyes locked onto hers, a clear demand in his gaze. I said, $50,000 to make him stop, he repeated, his voice growing more insistent. Naomi looked at the child, then at Richard. His eyes were cold, calculating, as though money could solve everything. But Naomi knew better. She had grown up in a world where nothing came easy, where respect wasn't given to people like her. But tonight, something inside her stirred. With steady hands, she approached the baby. Naomi spoke softly, the words gentle and calm, as if she had known the child forever. The baby, no older than a year, stopped crying for a moment, looking up at Naomi with wide, confused eyes. She gently offered him a stuffed bear she had tucked under her arm, a simple gesture, but it was all it took. The baby quieted. The room held its breath. Richard's face, once filled with frustration, froze. He blinked, as if the world had suddenly tilted. The silence was thick, heavy, and for a moment, it wasn't just the baby that had stopped crying. The entire cabin was silent, watching Naomi. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his $50,000. Naomi turned and walked back to the front of the cabin, her head held high. The passengers, once so caught up in their own worlds, now watched her with new eyes. The baby's cries had stopped, not because of money, but because someone had cared enough to do the right thing. Naomi knew her worth. And tonight, it had nothing to do with a paycheck. I sat in my seat, my eyes never leaving the billionaire CEO across from me. His face had gone pale, his fingers twitching on the armrests, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. His baby, the one who had been crying so loudly a moment ago, was now silent in his arms, clutching the stuffed bear that Naomi, the waitress, had given him. The moment had felt almost unreal. I could hear the sound of the air conditioning hum, the soft buzz of the overhead lights, but the silence in the cabin was so thick it seemed to suffocate all the noise. It was as if everyone had collectively held their breath. The tension was palpable. Naomi had stepped into that moment with nothing but her calm, her kindness, and her ability to do something that money couldn't. Richard Kessler, the CEO, had been ready to throw $50,000 at the problem, thinking that would fix it. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had just exposed the flaw in his thinking. Money could buy silence, but it couldn't buy compassion. It couldn't fix the human connection that Naomi had just created with that child. The billionaire CEO still sat there, staring at Naomi's retreating figure, a man frozen in disbelief. But that was the thing about people like him. They weren't used to being challenged, not in this way. He had never been in a position where someone like Naomi, a woman of color, a waitress in a uniform, could silence him with something as simple as a kind gesture. He had underestimated her. And now, his wealth and power seemed insignificant in the face of what she had just done. The passengers around him, the ones who had been trying to ignore the entire situation moments ago, were now looking at Naomi in a completely different light. Some of them, The ones who had tried to ignore the baby's cries or focus on their business calls were now watching her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. They had seen her as just another employee, just another person to serve them, to remain invisible. But not anymore. Naomi had stepped up in a way none of them expected, and they couldn't ignore it. Richard's eyes shifted from Naomi's back to his baby, who was now peacefully resting in his arms. His pride, his arrogance, his usual sense of control, it all seemed to crumble in that moment. He wasn't in control anymore. He had been shown something he couldn't buy, something that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The real power was in Naomi's simple act of kindness. She didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to defend herself, or explain why she had done what she did. Naomi had made her choice. She chose to act with humanity when it mattered most. And now, Richard Kessler, the man who had thought he could control everything, was left with nothing but a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful people aren't the ones with the most money. Naomi continued to walk down the aisle, as though nothing had happened. Her stride was calm, her posture straight, but there was something in the way she carried herself now, something different. She knew she had done the right thing, and in a world where respect was often tied to wealth, she had just reminded everyone that kindness was priceless. As she passed through the cabin, a few of the passengers nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of what had just occurred. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real. Naomi had turned the entire situation upside down with nothing more than a soft word and a stuffed bear. The cabin slowly came back to life, the hum of conversation starting again, but it was different now. The energy had shifted. Richard Kessler sat silently, his hands clenched in his lap, the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't used to feeling this way, and it made him uncomfortable. Naomi had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, I couldn't help but wonder how many others like Naomi were out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to show the world that real power doesn't come from money, it comes from the heart. I had never seen a billionaire look so small. Richard Kessler sat in his first-class seat, his face flushed with embarrassment, and his hands tightly gripping the armrests as though he could will away the shame he felt. His baby, the same child who had been crying nonstop just moments ago, was now peacefully dozing in his arms, cuddling the stuffed bear Naomi had given him. Richard's usual air of control, the self-assuredness that came with years of wealth and power, was gone. In its place was something foreign, discomfort. Naomi had done something that he, with all his money, could never have bought. She had given him a lesson in humility. The passengers around him had begun to look at Naomi differently too. Before, she had been just another face in the background, someone to fetch drinks, refill glasses, and ensure their comfort. But now, she was the one everyone was talking about. Her calm demeanor had cut through the tension in a way no amount of money could. The eyes of the passengers who had been silently observing, pretending not to notice the chaos of a crying baby, were now focused on Naomi. They could no longer ignore her. She had proven something to them, and to Richard Kessler. That sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness have the most profound impact. I watched as Naomi continued down the aisle, her steps steady, her eyes focused on the task at hand. She didn't linger for any praise, she didn't need it. She had done what she believed was right, and that was enough. She didn't need Richard's $50,000 to feel validated. Naomi's gesture had been simple, but it spoke volumes. She had taken control of the situation, not with money or force, but with compassion. Richard could buy 1,000 flights, could charter a private jet, could have anything he wanted with the swipe of his credit card, but he could not buy the peace Naomi had brought to that plane. For the first time, I really saw him not as a powerful CEO but as a man who had been humbled by the most unlikely of people, a waitress. He turned his gaze away from Naomi as she walked past him, his face still red with embarrassment. He glanced down at his baby, who was no longer crying, and for the first time in a long while, Richard Kessler didn't feel like the most powerful person in the room. His eyes wandered to the other passengers, who were now watching him. There was no denying it. They had all seen what had just happened, and the power dynamics had shifted. Naomi had taken a moment of chaos, one that could have been easily dismissed with money, and turned it into something meaningful, and it wasn't just the baby that had been soothed. Richard had been forced to confront something he had ignored for far too long, his own privilege. Naomi wasn't just the woman who served him a drink or handed him a napkin. She was the one who had shown him that humanity came before wealth. Richard sat there, staring at his baby, still trying to process the turn of events. Naomi had left him speechless, his wealth and status suddenly meaningless in the face of her calm composure. His mind raced with thoughts of how he could fix this, how he could make it right, but nothing came to mind. He couldn't buy this. He couldn't smooth over what had just happened with a check or a well-placed apology. Naomi had done something more powerful than money could ever achieve. The plane ride continued, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. The murmurs of conversation had started again, but there was a different tone now. Richard, the man, who had once commanded rooms with his presence, now sat quietly, his face drawn in contemplation. He had been outplayed, and he knew it. Naomi had done what no one expected. She had brought peace, not through money or status, but through kindness. As I looked around the cabin, I realized that Naomi had done more than calm a crying baby. She had shifted the very balance of power on that plane, showing everyone present that true power lies in the simplest acts of humanity. I sat quietly, watching Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO, as he continued to stare at his baby, now peacefully sleeping in his arms. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with a look of disbelief. It was clear he was still trying to process what had just happened. Naomi, the waitress, had turned the entire situation upside down with nothing more than a simple act of kindness. The power dynamics in the cabin had shifted, and Richard, for the first time in a long while, was no longer the most important person in the room. I couldn't help but reflect on the moments leading up to that turning point. It wasn't just Naomi's calm demeanor that had made the difference. It was her refusal to accept the way Richard had treated her and the situation. She didn't let the money, the power, or the expectations of others define her. Naomi didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify why she did what she did. The other passengers were starting to whisper, exchanging looks. Some were probably questioning why Naomi's actions had affected them so deeply. But the truth was, she had done something that money could never buy. Richard could have offered $50,000, but that would have only bought him silence. Naomi had brought peace, and there was no price for that. As Naomi continued down the aisle, she passed by Richard without a second glance. It was as though the moment had never happened, and yet, everything had changed. Her composure, her kindness, had left an indelible mark on everyone around her. I could see it in the way the other passengers were now watching her. They were no longer ignoring her presence. They had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions, something that made them question their own values. Richard's eyes followed Naomi, still unable to grasp what had just occurred. He had been so sure of his power, so convinced that his wealth could solve anything, that he never expected to be outmatched by a waitress. A woman who, by all standards, had far less than he did, had just shown him a truth he would never forget. Money could never buy what she had just given him: dignity, humanity, and a sense of responsibility. The silence in the cabin was almost deafening, not because of the baby's cries, but because of the weight of the moment. Richard had been humbled, and he knew it. He looked down at his baby, still resting in his arms, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes. Was it regret? Was it realization? Or was it just the dawning of a man who had never been forced to see beyond his own world? Naomi's actions were a quiet rebellion, but they were the kind of rebellion that made a lasting impact. She had done the right thing because it was the right thing to do, not because there was a reward at the end of it. It wasn't about money or recognition. It was about restoring dignity to a situation that had been full of disrespect. As the plane continued its flight, I couldn't help but think about how many times we let power and wealth dictate our interactions with others. How many times do we overlook the people who actually make a difference in our lives? Naomi had reminded us all of something important, that respect, kindness, and humanity cannot be bought. They must be earned, and sometimes, it only takes one person to show the rest of us what really matters. Richard sat quietly in his seat, still processing, still uncertain of how to navigate this new reality. He had been forced to confront something he didn't want to see, his own arrogance. And Naomi, the waitress, the woman who had been dismissed as insignificant, had shown him something greater than any deal or business transaction ever could. I could feel the shift in the air as the minutes passed. The hum of the plane, once so comforting, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO, sat frozen in his seat, still holding his baby, who was quietly resting, a stark contrast to the chaos just moments ago. His eyes were distant, his mind clearly processing the unexpected turn of events. Naomi, the waitress, had done something that no amount of money or status could ever do. She had taken control of the situation with simple humanity. The power had shifted, and it was almost impossible to ignore. Naomi continued with her duties, effortlessly gliding between the rows of seats. She had a quiet confidence about her now, one that didn't come from a paycheck or a uniform, but from something deeper. She wasn't just serving drinks or food, she was serving respect. She had changed the dynamics of the entire cabin with a few gentle words, and now everyone noticed her, even if they were too afraid to show it. Richard had always been used to being the center of attention. Whether it was in boardrooms, private jets, or lavish parties, he was the one everyone looked to. But here, on this plane, he had been outshined by someone he had once considered beneath him. Naomi had taught him a lesson he never saw coming. As the plane continued its journey, I watched as Richard's mind seemed to race. His usual sharpness, the quick calculations and strategic thinking, had abandoned him. He kept glancing at Naomi, almost as though he couldn't understand how she had done what she did. How had a simple waitress brought him to this moment of reckoning? The passengers around us, many of them successful in their own right, had also been affected. The room was still, but the air was thick with the recognition of what had just happened. Naomi had shown them that it wasn't just about wealth or power, it was about empathy and dignity, something that no amount of money could buy. I could see the unease in Richard's face as he looked at his baby, now sleeping soundly, and I wondered if he was finally realizing what he had been missing. It wasn't about the money he could throw around to fix situations or the control he wielded in every business meeting. It was about understanding the value of people, the ones he had ignored, the ones he had dismissed as insignificant. The moments that followed felt like a slow unraveling of everything Richard thought he knew about power. He had spent his life building an empire on dominance and control, but Naomi had done something far more profound. She had won without ever raising her voice. Without a single threat or demand, she had shown him that real power didn't lie in domination, it lay in quiet strength and the ability to do what was right when no one was watching. As the flight neared its descent, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The tension that had filled the cabin was now replaced with a new understanding, and I knew that Richard Kessler would never forget the lesson Naomi had taught him. Naomi had restored balance to a world that often valued power over people, wealth over kindness, and status over dignity. She had shown us all that sometimes the smallest acts of humanity could change the course of everything. And Richard, for all his wealth and success, was now forced to confront the fact that in the grand scheme of things, money was the least important thing in the room. What mattered was respect. What mattered was kindness. What mattered was humanity. And Naomi had just proven that it was the most powerful thing of all. I watched as Richard Kessler's face slowly transformed from disbelief to something I couldn't quite place, something between regret and reflection. His baby, who had been crying just moments ago, was now peacefully asleep in his arms, nestled against the stuffed bear that Naomi had given him. The once sharp, commanding presence of the CEO seemed to have disappeared, replaced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. He looked down at his child, then back at Naomi, who was moving through the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence commanding respect without a single word. It was almost as if Richard couldn't comprehend how someone like Naomi, a woman he had probably never noticed before, could outshine him in such a profound way. It wasn't that she had taken anything from him. No, it was something deeper. She had shown him something that money, power, or even his billion-dollar empire could never buy. It was the power of empathy, of kindness, of recognizing humanity in others, regardless of their status. Naomi had done it without hesitation. She had stepped in when it mattered most, not because she was asked, but because she saw a situation that required someone to act with heart. Richard was forced to reckon with the fact that all his wealth and influence had meant nothing in that moment. Naomi hadn't just calmed a crying baby, she had calmed a tense, suffocating atmosphere that no amount of money could relieve. And in doing so, she had restored something Richard hadn't realized. He had lost his connection to the simple, but powerful values of respect and kindness. The realization hit him slowly. He was no longer the king of this room. The rules had changed, and he had been caught in the shift. Naomi had taken control of the situation not through power, but through humility and selflessness. As she moved past him again, there was no smugness, no pride. She didn't need it. She had already won, not in the way Richard would have expected, but in the most meaningful way possible. Richard's gaze followed her, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe shame, maybe admiration, but it was there. Naomi's quiet confidence had stripped away the layers of arrogance that Richard had built up over the years. It wasn't just about wealth. It wasn't even about power. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter their station in life, deserved dignity. Naomi had taught him that. She had quietly and effortlessly exposed the fallacy that power was something to be wielded and dominated. She had shown that real power came from understanding and compassion, and that the true measure of a person wasn't their wealth, but their ability to act in the best interest of others. As the plane continued its journey, I could sense the shift not only in Richard but in the entire cabin. The energy had changed. Passengers, who had once been engrossed in their own worlds, silently judging or dismissing Naomi as just another employee, now looked at her with respect. The tension that had filled the air was gone. Naomi had turned a potentially uncomfortable situation into something memorable, not by force, but by simply doing what was right. She had put humanity before all else, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of power. The passengers, the crew, and most importantly, Richard, would never forget this moment. Richard's empire of control and dominance, built over years of hard work and sharp deals, had been overshadowed in a single moment. Not by another billionaire or a deal worth billions, but by the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen to act with compassion when it mattered most. Naomi had restored something much more valuable than Richard could ever buy. She had restored the idea that kindness, empathy, and humanity could change everything. As the flight continued, Richard sat in silence, still processing everything that had just unfolded. Naomi had taken control without taking anything. She had shown him that real power lay not in how much you could acquire, but in how much you could give. And as for Naomi, she didn't need to prove anything. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She had already won. I sat back in my seat, the quiet hum of the plane now almost comforting. The atmosphere had shifted in a way I had never expected. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO, had been a figure of undeniable power and influence for as long as I could remember. Yet, after Naomi's simple, kind gesture, I saw him for the first time as just another person, someone who, despite his wealth and status, had been humbled by the smallest act of humanity. Naomi moved through the cabin as though nothing had changed, but everything had. She didn't seek any acknowledgement. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than anything anyone could say. Richard was still grappling with the reality of what had just happened. He hadn't known how to respond. No amount of money or business deals could erase the impact of Naomi's quiet defiance. He could throw $50,000 at a problem and expect it to go away. But this was different. This was something that could never be bought. His wealth had failed him in the most unexpected way, and it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. Naomi's calm, graceful demeanor had taken the power out of his hands and reminded him of something he had long forgotten: his humanity. Richard's eyes followed Naomi as she made her way to the front of the plane. The passengers, who had been silent spectators only moments ago, now looked at her with newfound respect. Naomi had changed the tone of the entire flight, not with a grand display of force, but with a quiet, unshakable strength. The power had reversed, and it was something that would stay with Richard for a long time. I could almost hear his thoughts, the way he was replaying the moment over and over in his mind. How had Naomi done it? How had she made him, a man who had spent his life controlling everything around him, feel so powerless? But the truth was simple. Naomi hadn't needed to do anything extravagant. She had simply done the right thing. She had acted with kindness when no one else would. In that moment, Richard realized that the real power in this world wasn't about money or influence. It was about the ability to see others as equals, to treat them with respect, and to act with compassion when it truly mattered. Naomi's gesture had been small, but it had changed everything. As the plane continued on its course, I could feel the tension lifting. The passengers around me, who had been quietly observing, began to speak in hushed tones, their conversations now filled with a different energy. Richard, meanwhile, sat in silence, his hand still holding his baby, but his mind clearly miles away. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Naomi had made sure of that. She had shown him a lesson that no amount of wealth could have taught him. Kindness, humility, and empathy were the real markers of strength. Naomi had quietly exposed the cracks in Richard's empire, showing him that no amount of money could shield him from the simple truth. And as the plane began its descent, I couldn't help but wonder how this moment would shape Richard from here on out. Would he change? Would he take the lesson Naomi had given him to heart? Or would he go back to his old ways, unable to recognize the value of what she had shown him? The fact that Richard had been forced to face this truth in front of everyone was no small thing. His power, once unchallenged, had been shattered by a woman who had done nothing more than show compassion. And as I watched Naomi, still moving with the same quiet confidence, I realized that sometimes the most powerful revolutions come not from loud protests or grand gestures, but from the smallest actions. Naomi had shown us all that true power wasn't about how much we had, it was about how much we were willing to give. And in that moment, she had given Richard a lesson he would never forget. I could feel the weight of the moment settling into the cabin as the flight continued its course. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO, sat quietly, his eyes cast downward as if processing everything that had happened. His baby, who had been the center of the chaos just an hour ago, was now peacefully sleeping in his arms, completely unaware of the ripple effect his cries had caused. Richard's expression was unreadable, his mind clearly racing. Naomi had done something he never expected. She had disrupted his world, shaken his sense of control, and made him realize something he hadn't considered for a long time: he wasn't invincible. His money, his empire, his power, all of it had meant nothing in that moment. Naomi had shown him a truth that money could never buy. As Richard sat there, lost in his thoughts, Naomi continued with her work, moving through the cabin with the same calm demeanor she had maintained since the moment she stepped in to handle the situation. But this time, there was something different about her. It wasn't just the way she walked with confidence, or how she carried herself as though she owned the room. It was the way the passengers, who had once ignored her as just another employee, now looked at her with newfound respect. Naomi hadn't just calmed a crying baby. She had demonstrated what true strength was. She had stood up to Richard, not with confrontation, but with empathy. She had taken control of the situation with grace, and in doing so, she had shown him that compassion was more powerful than any dollar amount. The passengers, once so absorbed in their own lives, now saw Naomi differently. She wasn't just the woman who served their drinks or refilled their glasses. She was the one who had reminded them that humanity and respect were the things that truly mattered. Naomi had shifted the energy in the cabin, and it was clear that no one would ever look at her the same way again. As the flight neared its end, I couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the way Richard was sitting. His posture had softened, his shoulders no longer tense with the same arrogance they had carried earlier. It was as if Naomi's actions had broken down the walls he had carefully constructed around himself. For the first time in a long time, Richard Kessler seemed to be questioning his place in the world. His empire of wealth and control had been shattered in a matter of minutes by something he couldn't buy. Naomi had given him a lesson in humanity that no amount of money or status could have ever provided. The truth was undeniable. Money could buy influence, it could buy luxury, it could buy power, but it couldn't buy the kind of respect Naomi had earned in that moment. Richard had learned that lesson the hard way. As I watched him sit there, holding his baby, still deep in thought, I realized that Naomi had not only changed his perspective, she had changed the entire atmosphere of the flight. The dynamic had shifted. Naomi had taken what could have been a humiliating situation and turned it into something profound. She had taken power back, not through force or wealth, but through simple, quiet strength. And in doing so, she had reminded us all that the most important things in life couldn't be bought. Richard had lost a deal before. He had faced criticism, but nothing compared to this moment, the moment when he had been exposed as just another person who had forgotten what it meant to treat others with dignity. The plane touched down, and as the seatbelt sign blinked off, Richard remained in his seat, lost in thought. Naomi, on the other hand, moved toward the back of the plane, continuing her work with the same quiet dignity. And in that moment, I knew that Naomi had won not just the respect of the passengers, but also something far more important. She had reminded Richard, and all of us, that true strength comes not from wealth or power, but from how we treat the people around us. It was a lesson that would stay with Richard long after the flight ended. As the plane touched down, the usual rush of passengers getting ready to disembark was muted. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO, remained seated, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Naomi had already moved to the back of the plane, collecting empty cups and tidying the cabin, but I noticed her movements were different now, more deliberate, more grounded. She wasn't just doing her job anymore. She was carrying a quiet, powerful dignity that no one could ignore. I watched Richard as he slowly gathered his things, still holding his baby, who was now peacefully asleep, oblivious to the chaos that had erupted just hours before. He didn't seem in a hurry to leave. He was processing, reflecting, and in that moment, I wondered if Naomi's quiet act of compassion had planted a seed of change in him. He had always been the kind of person who believed that money and power could fix everything. He had been the one who mocked Naomi and tossed his wealth around like a shield. But Naomi had done something Richard couldn't have foreseen. She had shown him that the true measure of strength wasn't in wealth or influence, but in how you treat others. Richard had been forced to confront the most uncomfortable truth. His money had been powerless in the face of kindness. Naomi had outclassed him without trying. She had humbled him without saying a word. The rest of the passengers were slowly getting up, pulling their bags from the overhead compartments, and heading toward the exit. They all seemed to move a little slower than usual, some of them casting glances back toward Richard. It was as though the entire cabin had witnessed something significant, something that had shifted the power dynamic in a way no one expected. Naomi had restored something far more important than the quiet comfort of first class. She had restored the idea that humanity should always come first. Richard stood up, still holding his baby, and walked down the aisle toward the exit. As he passed Naomi, there was a moment of pause, just long enough to catch her eye. Richard didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But the look he gave her said it all. It was a look of acknowledgement, of respect, and perhaps even of apology. Naomi's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already done what needed to be done. She had already won. Richard stepped off the plane, and for the first time in a long time, I saw him walk away from something he couldn't buy. Naomi continued her work, but she wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was a reminder that the most powerful people in the world aren't always the ones with the most money, the biggest businesses, or the loudest voices. Sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones who choose to act with kindness, with dignity, and with respect. Naomi had taken a moment of chaos, of tension, and she had turned it into something meaningful. She had shown Richard, and all of us, that true strength comes from knowing your worth and standing by what's right, no matter who's watching. As I left the plane, I couldn't help but think that the world needed more people like Naomi. People who don't seek recognition but whose actions leave a lasting impact. People who remind us that kindness is the most powerful currency we can spend. Richard Kessler, for all his wealth, had been shown a lesson that he would never forget, that money might buy influence, but it could never buy the respect that Naomi had earned in that one quiet moment. And as for Naomi, she didn't need to prove anything. She had already changed everything. This black story showcases the powerful impact of kindness and empathy in the face of arrogance and privilege. When a billionaire CEO's baby cries nonstop on a plane, the tension in the cabin escalates. The CEO, used to controlling every situation with money, demands the baby be silenced with a large bribe, but what happens next changes everything. A black waitress, Naomi, steps in with a quiet, compassionate gesture that no amount of money can replicate. In a moment of humility, Naomi teaches the CEO a life-changing lesson about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of power. This black story not only highlights the strength and grace of a black woman but also reminds us all that true power doesn't come from wealth or influence, it comes from treating others with humanity. Naomi's actions shift the energy in the cabin, earning her the respect of the passengers, including the billionaire, who now faces the uncomfortable reality that his money has no control over human decency. Naomi's simple act of kindness in this black story serves as a powerful reminder that empathy can break down walls and change perspectives, proving that sometimes the most profound shifts in power happen in the quietest of moments. As the story unfolds, it is clear that this black story is one of redemption and reflection, demonstrating how one person's integrity can influence and change even the most powerful individuals. Naomi's actions not only transform the flight but leave a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it, showing that true strength lies in humanity, not wealth.